I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'm going to be reading a selection from Mr Keckley's autobiography. Mr Keckley was born into slavery in 1818 in Virginia. Despite brutal treatment and exploitation by the family who enslaved her, she was able to purchase freedom for herself and her son George in 1855. Keckley built a reputation as a seamstress that led her to become modiste to Mary Todd Lincoln and eventually her confidant during her turbulent years in the White House. In 1868, Keckley published a memoir of her life that included a very frank account of the Lincolns' family life. Here are the first few chapters of this memoir. Let's get started. Behind the Scenes by Mr Keckley, formerly a slave but more recently modiste and friend to Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, or 30 years a slave and 4 years in the White House. Chapter 1. Where I Was Born. My life has been an eventful one. I was born a slave, was the child of slave parents, therefore I came upon the earth free in godlike thought, but fettered in action. My birthplace was Dinwiddie Courthouse in Virginia. My recollections of childhood are distinct, perhaps for the reason that many stirring incidents are associated with that period. I am now on the shady side of 40, and as I sit alone in my room, the brain is busy, and a rapidly moving panorama brings scene after scene before me, some pleasant and others sad, and when I thus greet old familiar faces, I often find myself wondering if I am not living the past over again. The visions are so terribly distinct that I almost imagine them to be real. Hour after hour, I sit while the scenes are being shifted, and as I gaze upon the panorama of the past, I realize how crowded with incidents my life has been. Every day seems like a romance within itself, and the years grow into ponderous volumes. As I cannot condense, I must omit many strange passages in my history. From such a wilderness of events, it is difficult to make a selection. But, as I am not writing altogether the history of myself, I will confine my story to the most important incidents which I believe influenced the molding of my character. As I glance over the crowded sea of the past, these incidents stand forth prominently, the guideposts of memory. I presume that I must have been 4 years old when I first began to remember. At least I cannot now recall anything occurring previous to this period. My master, Colonel A. Burwell, was somewhat unsettled in his business affairs, and while I was yet an infant, he made several removals. While living at Hampton-Sydney College, Prince Edward County, Virginia, Mrs. Burwell gave birth to a daughter, a sweet black-eyed baby, my earliest and fondest pet. To take care of this baby was my first duty. True, I was but a child myself, only 4 years old, but then I had been raised in a hearty school, had been taught to rely upon myself and to prepare myself to render assistance to others. The lesson was not a bitter one, for I was too young to indulge in philosophy, and the precepts that I then treasured and practiced, I believe, developed those principles of character which have enabled me to triumph over so many difficulties. Notwithstanding all the wrongs that slavery heaped upon me, I can bless it for one thing: youth's important lesson of self-reliance. The baby was named Elizabeth, and it was pleasant for me to be assigned a duty in connection with it, for the discharge of that duty transferred me from the rude cabin to the household of my master. My simple attire was a short dress and a little white apron. My old mistress encouraged me in rocking the cradle by telling me that if I would wash over the baby well, keep the flies out of its face, and not let it cry, I should be its little maid. This was a golden promise, and I required no better inducement for the faithful performance of my task. I began to rock the cradle most industriously, when lo, out pitched little pet on the floor. I instantly cried out, "Oh, the baby is on the floor!" And not knowing what to do, I seized the fire shovel in my perplexity, and was trying to shovel up my tender charge, when my mistress called to me to let the child alone, and then ordered that I be taken out and lashed for my carelessness. The blows were not administered with a light hand, I assure you, and doubtless the severity of the lashing has made me remember the incident so well. This was the first time I was punished in this cruel way, but not the last. The black-eyed baby that I called my pet grew into a self-willed girl, and in after years was the cause of much trouble to me. I grew strong and healthy, and notwithstanding I knit socks and attended to various kinds of work, I was repeatedly told, when even 14 years old, that I would never be worth my salt. When I was 8, Mr. Burwell's family consisted of 6 sons and 4 daughters, with a large family of servants. My mother was kind and forbearing. Mrs. Burwell was a hard taskmaster, and as mother had so much work to do in making clothes, etc., for the family, besides the slaves, I determined to render her all the assistance in my power, and in rendering her such assistance, my young energies were taxed to the utmost. I was my mother's only child, which made her love for me all the stronger. I did not know much of my father, for he was the slave of another man, and when Mr. Burwell moved from Dinwiddie, he was separated from us, and only allowed to visit my mother twice a year, during Easter holidays and Christmas. At last Mr. Burwell determined to reward my mother by making an arrangement with the owner of my father, by which the separation of my parents could be brought to an end. It was a bright day indeed for my mother when it was announced that my father was coming to live with us. The old weary look faded from her face, and she worked as if her heart was in every task. But the golden days did not last long. The radiant dream faded all too soon. In the morning my father called me to him and kissed me, then held me out at arm's length as if he were regarding his child with pride. "She is growing into a fine, large girl," he remarked to my mother. "I don't know what I like best, you or Lizzie, as both are so dear to me." My mother's name was Agnes, and my father delighted to call me his little Lizzie. While yet my father and mother were speaking hopefully, joyfully of the future, Mr. Burwell came into the cabin with a letter in his hand. He was a kind master in some things, and as gently as possible informed my parents that they must part. For in 2 hours my father must join his master at Dinwiddie, and go with him to the West, where he had determined to make his future home. The announcement fell upon the little circle in that rude log cabin like a thunderbolt. I can remember the scene as if it were but yesterday, how my father cried out against the cruel separation, his last kiss, his wild straining of my mother to his bosom, the solemn prayer to heaven, the tears and sobs, the fearful anguish of broken hearts. The last kiss, the last goodbye, and he, my father, was gone, gone forever. The shadow eclipsed the sunshine, and love brought despair. The parting was eternal. The cloud had no silver lining, but I trust it will be all silver in heaven. We who are crushed to earth with heavy chains, who travel a weary, rugged, thorny road, groping through midnight darkness on earth, earn our right to enjoy the sunshine in the great hereafter. At the grave, at least, we should be permitted to lay our burdens down, that a new world, a world of brightness, may open to us. The light that is denied us here should grow into a flood of effulgence beyond the dark, mysterious shadows of death. Deep as was the distress of my mother in parting with my father, her sorrow did not screen her from insult. My old mistress said to her, "Stop your nonsense. There is no necessity for you putting on airs. Your husband is not the only slave that has been sold from his family, and you are not the only one who has had to part. There are plenty more men about here, and if you want a husband so badly, stop your crying and go find another." To these unfeeling words my mother made no reply. She turned away in stoical silence, with a curl of that loathing scorn upon her lips which swelled in her heart. My father and mother never met again in this world. They kept up a regular correspondence for years, and the most precious mementos of my existence are the faded old letters that he wrote, full of love, and always hoping that the future would bring brighter days. In nearly every letter is a message for me. Tell my darling little Lizzie, he writes, to be a good girl and to learn her book. Kiss her for me and tell her that I will come to see her some day. Thus he wrote time and time again, but he never came. He lived in hope, but died without ever seeing his wife and child. I note a few extracts from one of my father's letters to my mother, following copy literally. Shelbyville, September 6, 1833. Mrs. Agnes Hobbs. Dear wife, my dear beloved wife, I am more than glad to meet with the opportunity to write these few lines to you by my mistress, who are now about starting to Virginia, and several others of my old friends are with her. In company, Mrs. Ann Roos, the wife of Master Thomas Roos, and Dan Williard and his family, and I am very sorry that I haven't had the chance to go with them, as I feel determined to see you if life lasts. I am now here and out at this place, so I am not able to get out at this time. I am right well and hearty, and all the rest of the master's family. I heard this evening by mistress that are just come from there, all sends love to you and all my old friends. I have living in a town called Shelbyville, and I have wrote a great many letters since I've been here, and almost ready to myself that is out of the question to write any more at all. My dear wife, I don't feel nowise like giving out to writing to you as yet, and I hope when you get this letter that you will be encouraged to write me a letter. I am well satisfied at my living at this place, and am making money for my own benefit, and I hope that it's to yours also if I live to see next year. I shall have my own time from master by giving him $120 a year, and I think that I shall be doing good business at that, and have something more than all that. I hope, with God's help, I may be able to rejoice with you on earth and in heaven. Let's meet when I am determined to never stop praying, not on this earth, and I hope, praise God in glory, there will meet to part no more forever. So, my dear wife, I hope to meet you in paradise to praise God forever. I want Elizabeth to be a good girl, and not to think that because I am bound so far that gods have not been able to open the way. George Pleasant Hobbs, a servant of Grum. The last letter that my mother received from my father was dated Shelbyville, Tennessee, March 20th, 1839. He writes in a cheerful strain and hopes to see her soon. Alas, he looked forward to a meeting in vain. Year after year, the one great hope swelled in his heart, but the hope was only realized beyond the dark portals of the grave. When I was about 7 years old, I witnessed, for the first time, the sale of a human being. We were living at Prince Edward in Virginia, and master had just purchased his hogs for the winter, for which he was unable to pay in full. To escape from his embarrassment, it was necessary to sell one of his slaves. Little Joe, the son of the cook, was selected as the victim. His mother was ordered to dress him up in his Sunday clothes and send him to the house. He came in with a bright face, was placed in the scales, and was sold, like the hogs, at so much per pound. His mother was kept in ignorance of the transaction, but her suspicions were aroused. When her son started for Petersburg in the wagon, the truth began to dawn upon her mind, and she pleaded piteously that her boy should not be taken from her. But master quieted her by telling her that he was simply going to town with the wagon and would be back in the morning. Morning came, but little Joe did not return to his mother. Morning after morning passed, and the mother went down to the grave without ever seeing her child again. One day she was whipped for grieving for her lost boy. Colonel Burwell never liked to see one of his slaves wear a sorrowful face, and those who offended in this particular way were always punished. Alas, the sunny face of the slave is not always an indication of sunshine in the heart. Colonel Burwell at one time owned about 70 slaves, all of which were sold, and in a majority of instances wives were separated from husbands and children from their parents. Slavery in the border states 40 years ago was different from what it was 20 years ago. Time seemed to soften the hearts of master and mistress, and to ensure kinder and more humane treatment to bondsmen and bondswomen. When I was quite a child, an incident occurred which my mother afterwards impressed more strongly on my mind. One of my uncles, a slave of Colonel Burwell, lost a pair of plow lines, and when the loss was made known, the master gave him a new pair, and told him that if he did not take care of them, he would punish him severely. In a few weeks, the second pair of lines was stolen, and my uncle hung himself rather than meet the displeasure of his master. My mother went to the spring in the morning for a pail of water, and on looking up into the willow tree which shaded the bubbling crystal stream, she discovered the lifeless form of her brother suspended beneath one of the strong branches. Rather than be punished the way Colonel Burwell punished his servants, he took his own life. Slavery had its dark side. Chapter 2. Girlhood and its Sorrows. I must pass rapidly over the stirring events of my early life. When I was about 14 years old, I went to live with my master's eldest son, a Presbyterian minister. His salary was small, and he was burdened with a helpless wife, a girl that he had married in the humbler walks of life. She was morbidly sensitive, and imagined that I regarded her with contemptuous feelings because she was of poor parentage. I was their only servant, and a gracious loan at that. They were not able to buy me, so my old master sought to render them assistance by allowing them the benefit of my services. From the very first I did the work of 3 servants, and yet I was scolded and regarded with distrust. The years passed slowly, and I continued to serve them, and at the same time grew into strong, healthy womanhood. I was nearly 18 when we removed from Virginia to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where young Mr. Burwell took charge of a church. The salary was small, and we still had to practice the closest economy. Mr. Bingham, a hard, cruel man, the village schoolmaster, was a member of my young master's church, and he was a frequent visitor to the parsonage. She, whom I called mistress, seemed to be desirous to wreak vengeance on me for something, and Bingham became her ready tool. During this time my master was unusually kind to me. He was naturally a good-hearted man, but was influenced by his wife. It was Saturday evening, and while I was bending over the bed watching the baby that I had just hushed into slumber, Mr. Bingham came to the door and asked me to go with him to his study. Wondering what he meant by this strange request, I followed him, and when we had entered the study, he closed the door and in his blunt way remarked, "Lizzie, I am going to flog you." I was thunderstruck and tried to think if I had been remiss in anything. I could not recollect of doing anything to deserve punishment, and with surprise exclaimed, "Whip me, Mr. Bingham. What for?" "No matter," he replied. "I am going to whip you, so take down your dress this instant." Recollect, I was 18 years of age, and a woman fully developed, and yet this man coolly bade me take down my dress. I drew myself up proudly, firmly, and said, "No, Mr. Bingham, I shall not take down my dress before you. Moreover, you shall not whip me unless you prove the stronger. Nobody has a right to whip me but my own master, and nobody shall do it if I can prevent it." My words seemed to exasperate him. He seized a rope, caught me roughly, and tried to tie me. I resisted with all my strength, but he was the stronger of the two, and after a hard struggle succeeded in binding my hands and tearing my dress from my back. Then he picked up a rawhide and began to ply it freely over my shoulders. With steady hand and practiced eye, he would raise the instrument of torture, nerve himself for a blow, and with fearful force the rawhide descended upon the quivering flesh. It cut the skin, raised great welts, and the warm blood trickled down my back. Oh God, I can feel the torture now, the terrible excruciating agony of those moments. I did not scream. I was too proud to let my tormentor know what I was suffering. I closed my lips firmly, that not even a groan might escape from them, and I stood like a statue while the keen lash cut deep into my flesh. As soon as I was released, stunned with pain, bruised and bleeding, I went home and rushed into the presence of the master and his wife, wildly exclaiming, "Master Robert, why did you let Mr. Bingham flog me? What have I done that I should be so punished?" "Go away," he gruffly answered. "Do not bother me." I would not be put off thus. "What have I done? I will know why I have been flogged." I saw his cheeks flush with anger, but I did not move. He rose to his feet, and on my refusing to go without an explanation, seized a chair, struck me, and felled me to the floor. I rose, bewildered, almost dead with pain, crept to my room, dressed my bruised arm and back as best I could, and then lay down, but not to sleep. No, I could not sleep, for I was suffering mental as well as bodily torture. My spirit rebelled against the unjustness that had been inflicted upon me, and though I tried to smother my anger and to forgive those who had been so cruel to me, it was impossible. The next morning I was more calm, and I believe that if I could then have forgiven everything for the sake of one kind word. But the kind word was not proffered, and it may be possible that I grew somewhat wayward and sullen. Though I had faults, I know now, as I felt then, harshness was the poorest inducement for the correction of them. It seems that Mr. Bingham had pledged himself to Mrs. Burwell to subdue what he called my stubborn pride. On Friday, following the Saturday on which I was so savagely beaten, Mr. Bingham again directed me to come to his study. I went, but with the determination to offer resistance should he attempt to flog me again. On entering the room, I found him prepared with a new rope and a new rawhide. I told him that I was ready to die, but he could not conquer me. In struggling with him, I bit his finger severely, when he seized a heavy stick and beat me with it in a shameful manner. Again I went home sore and bleeding, with pride as strong and defiant as ever. The following Thursday, Mr. Bingham again tried to conquer me, but in vain. We struggled, and he struck me many savage blows. As I stood bleeding before him, nearly exhausted with his efforts, he burst into tears and declared that it would be a sin to beat me any more. My suffering at last subdued his hard heart. He asked my forgiveness, and afterwards was an altered man. He was never known to strike one of his servants from that day forward. Mr. Burwell, he who preached the love of heaven, who glorified the precepts and examples of Christ, who expounded the Holy Scriptures Sabbath after Sabbath from the pulpit, when Mr. Bingham refused to whip me any more, was urged by his wife to punish me himself. One morning he went to the woodpile, took an oak broom, cut the handle off, and with this heavy handle attempted to conquer me. I fought him, but he proved the strongest. At the sight of my bleeding form, his wife fell upon her knees and begged him to desist. My distress touched even her cold, jealous heart. I was so badly bruised that I was unable to leave my bed for 5 days. I will not dwell upon the bitter anguish of these hours, for even the thought of them now makes me shudder. The Reverend Mr. Burwell was not yet satisfied. He resolved to make another attempt to subdue my proud, rebellious spirit, made the attempt, and again failed, when he told me with an air of penitence that he should never strike me another blow, and faithfully he kept his word. These revolting scenes created a great sensation at the time, were the talk of the town and neighborhood, and I flatter myself that the actions of those who had conspired against me were not viewed in a light to reflect much credit upon them. The savage efforts to subdue my pride were not the only things that brought me suffering and deep mortification during my residence at Hillsborough. I was regarded as fair-looking for one of my race, and for 4 years a white man, I spare the world his name, had base designs upon me. I do not care to dwell upon the subject, for it is one that is fraught with pain. Suffice it to say that he persecuted me for 4 years, and I became a mother. The child of which he was the father was the only child that I ever brought into the world. If my poor boy ever suffered any humiliating pangs on account of birth, he could not blame his mother, for God knows she did not wish to give him life. He must blame the edicts of that society which deemed it no crime to undermine the virtue of girls in my then position. Among the old letters preserved by my mother, I find the following, written by myself while at Hillsborough. In this connection, I desire to state that Reverend Robert Burwell is now living at Charlotte, North Carolina. Hillsborough, April 10th, 1838. My dear Mother, I have been intending to write to you for a long time, but numerous things have prevented, and for that reason you must excuse me. I thought very hard of you for not writing to me, but hope that you will answer this letter as soon as you receive it, and tell me how you like Mansfield, and if you have seen any of old acquaintances, or if you yet know of any brick house people who I think so much of. I want to hear of the family at home very much, indeed. I really believe you and all the family have forgotten me. If not, I certainly should have heard from some of you since I left Boyton, if it were only a line. Nevertheless, I love you all very dearly, and shall, although I never see you again, nor ever expect to. Miss Anna is going to Petersburg next winter, but she says she does not intend to take me. What reason she has for leaving me I cannot tell. I have often wished that I lived where I knew I could never see you, for then I would not have my hopes raised, and to be disappointed in this manner. However, it is said that a bad beginning makes a good ending, but I hardly expect to see that happy day at this place. Give my love to all the family, both white and black. I was very much obliged to you for the presents you sent me last summer, although it is quite late in the day to be thanking for them. Tell Aunt Bella that I was much obliged to her for the present. I have been so particular with it that I have only worn it once. There have been 6 weddings since October. The most respectable one was about a fortnight ago. I was asked to be the first attendant, but, as usual with all my expectations, I was disappointed, for on the wedding day I felt more like being locked up in a 3-cornered box than attending a wedding. About a week before Christmas, I was bridesmaid for Anne Nash. When the night came, I was in quite a trouble. I did not know whether my frock was clean or dirty. I had only a week's notice, and the body and sleeves to make, and only 1 hour every night to work on it. So you can see with these troubles to overcome, my chance was rather slim. I must now close, although I could fill 10 pages with my griefs and misfortunes. No tongue could express them as I feel. Don't forget me, though, and answer my letters soon. I will write you again, and would write more now, but Miss Anna says it is time I had finished. Tell Miss Elizabeth that I wish she would make haste and get married, for Mistress says that I belong to her when she gets married. I wish you would send me a pretty frock this summer. If you will send it to Mrs. Robertson's, Miss Bet will send it to me. Farewell, darling mother, your affectionate daughter, Elizabeth Hobbs. Chapter 3. How I Gained My Freedom. The years passed and brought many changes to me, but on these I will not dwell, as I wish to hasten to the most interesting part of my story. My troubles in North Carolina were brought to an end by my unexpected return to Virginia, where I lived with Mr. Garland, who had married Miss Anne Burwell, one of my old master's daughters. His life was not a prosperous one, and after struggling with the world for several years, he left his native state, a disappointed man. He moved to St. Louis, hoping to improve his fortunes in the West, but ill luck followed him there, and he seemed to be unable to escape from the influence of the evil star of his destiny. When his family, myself included, joined him in his new home on the banks of the Mississippi, we found him so poor that he was unable to pay the dues on a letter advertised as in the post office for him. The necessities of the family were so great that it was proposed to place my mother out at service. The idea was shocking to me. Every gray hair in her old head was dear to me, and I could not bear the thought of her going to work for strangers. She had been raised in the family, had watched the growth of each child from infancy to maturity. They had been the objects of her kindest care, and she was wound round them as the vine winds itself around the rugged oak. They had been the central figures in her dream of life, a dream beautiful to her, since she had basked in the sunshine of no other. And now they proposed to destroy each tendril of affection, to cloud the sunshine of her existence when the day was drawing to a close, when the shadows of solemn night were rapidly approaching. My mother, my poor aged mother, to go among strangers to toil for a living. No, 1,000 times no. I would rather work my fingers to the bone, bend over my sewing until the film of blindness gathered in my eyes, nay, even beg from street to street. I told Mr. Garland so, and he gave me permission to see what I could do. I was fortunate in obtaining work, and in a short time I had acquired something of a reputation as a seamstress and dressmaker. The best ladies in St. Louis were my patrons, and when my reputation was once established, I never lacked for orders. With my needle, I kept bread in the mouths of 17 persons for 2 years and 5 months, while I was working so hard that others might live in comparative comfort, and move in those circles of society to which their birth gave them entrance. The thought often occurred to me whether I was really worth my salt or not, and then perhaps the lips curled with a bitter sneer. It may seem strange that I should place so much emphasis upon words thoughtlessly, idly spoken, but then we do many strange things in life, and cannot always explain the motives that actuate us. The heavy task was too much for me, and my health began to give way. About this time, Mr. Keckley, whom I had met in Virginia and learned to regard with more than friendship, came to St. Louis. He sought my hand in marriage, and for a long time I refused to consider his proposal, for I could not bear the thought of bringing children into slavery, of adding one single recruit to the millions bound to hopeless servitude, fettered and shackled with chains stronger and heavier than manacles of iron. I made a proposition to buy myself and son. The proposition was bluntly declined, and I was commanded never to broach the subject again. I would not be put off thus, for hope pointed to a freer, brighter life in the future. Why should my son be held in slavery? I often asked myself. He came into the world through no will of mine, and yet God only knows how I loved him. The Anglo-Saxon blood as well as the African flowed in his veins. The two currents commingled, one singing of freedom, the other silent and sullen with generations of despair. Why should not the Anglo-Saxon triumph? Why should it be weighed down with the rich blood typical of the tropics? Must the life current of one race bind the other race in chains as strong and enduring as if there had been no Anglo-Saxon taint? By the laws of God and nature, as interpreted by man, one half of my boy was free, and why should not this fair birthright of freedom remove the curse from the other half, raise it into the bright, joyous sunshine of liberty? I could not answer these questions of my heart that almost maddened me, and I learned to regard human philosophy with mistrust. Much as I respected the authority of my master, I could not remain silent on a subject that so nearly concerned me. One day, when I insisted on knowing whether he would permit me to purchase myself, and what price I must pay for myself, he turned to me in a petulant manner, thrust his hand into his pocket, drew forth a bright silver $0.25, and proffering it to me, said, "Lizzie, I have told you often not to trouble me with such a question. If you really wish to leave me, take this. It will pay the passage of yourself and boy on the ferry boat, and when you are on the other side of the river, you will be free. It is the cheapest way I know of to accomplish what you desire." I looked at him in astonishment and earnestly replied, "No, master, I do not wish to be free in such a manner. If such had been my wish, I should never have troubled you about obtaining your consent to my purchasing myself. I can cross the river any day, as you well know, and I have frequently done so, but will never leave you in such a manner. By the laws of the land I am your slave, you are my master, and I will only be free by such means as the law of the country provide." He expected this answer, and I knew that he was pleased. Some time afterwards he told me that he had reconsidered the question, that I had served his family faithfully, that I deserved my freedom, and that he would take 1,200 for myself and my boy. This was joyful intelligence for me, and the reflection of hope gave a silver lining to the dark cloud of my life. Faint, it is true, but still a silver lining. Taking a perspective glance at liberty, I consented to marry. The wedding was a great event in the family. The ceremony took place in the parlor, in the presence of the family and a number of guests. Mr. Garland gave me away, and the pastor, Bishop Hawkes, performed the ceremony, who had solemnized the bridals of Mr. G's own children. The day was a happy one, but it faded all too soon. Mr. Keckley, let me speak kindly of his faults, proved dissipated, and a burden instead of a helpmate. More than all, I learned that he was a slave instead of a free man, as he represented himself to be. With the simple explanation that I lived with him 8 years, let charity draw around him the mantle of silence. I went to work in earnest to purchase my freedom, but the years passed and I was still a slave. Mr. Garland's family claimed so much of my attention, in fact, I supported them, that I was not able to accumulate anything. In the meantime, Mr. Garland died, and Mr. Burwell, a Mississippi planter, came to St. Louis to settle up the estate. He was a kind-hearted man and said I should be free and would afford me every facility to raise the necessary amount to pay the price of my liberty. Several schemes were urged upon me by my friends. At last I formed a resolution to go to New York, state my case, and appeal to the benevolence of the people. The plan seemed feasible, and I made preparations to carry it out. When I was almost ready to turn my face northward, Mrs. Garland told me that she would require the names of 6 gentlemen who would vouch for my return, and become responsible for the amount at which I was valued. I had many friends in St. Louis, and as I believed that they had confidence in me, I felt I could readily obtain the names desired. I started out, stated my case, and obtained 5 signatures to the paper, and my heart throbbed with pleasure, for I did not believe that the 6th would refuse me. I called, he listened patiently, and then remarked, "Yes, Lizzie, the scheme is a fair one, and you shall have my name. But I shall bid you good-bye when you start." "Good-bye for a short time," I ventured to add. "No, good-bye for all time," and he looked at me as if he would read my very soul with his eyes. I was startled. "What do you mean, Mr. Farrow? Surely you do not think I do not mean to come back?" "No." "No? What then?" "Simply this. You mean to come back. That is, you mean so now. But you never will. When you reach New York, the abolitionists will tell you what savages we are, and they will prevail on you to stay there, and we shall never see you again." "But I assure you, Mr. Farrow, you are mistaken. I not only mean to come back, but will come back, and pay every cent of the $1,200 for myself and child." I was beginning to feel sick at heart, for I could not accept the signature of this man when he had no faith in my pledges. No, slavery, eternal slavery, rather than to be regarded with distrust by those whose respect I esteemed. "But I am not mistaken," he persisted. "Time will show. When you start for the north, I shall bid you good-bye." The heart grew heavy. Every ray of sunshine was eclipsed. With humbled pride, weary step, tearful face, and a dull, aching pain, I left the house. I walked along the street mechanically. The cloud had no silver lining now. The rosebuds of hope had withered and died without lifting up their heads to receive the dew kiss of morning. There was no morning for me. All was night, dark night. I reached my own home, and weeping threw myself upon the bed. My trunk was packed, my luncheon was prepared by Mother, the cars were ready to bear me where I would not hear the clank of chains, where I would breathe the free, invigorating breezes of the glorious north. I had dreamed such a happy dream, and imagination had drunk of the water, the pure, sweet, crystal water of life. But now, the flowers had withered before my eyes, darkness had settled down upon me like a pall, and I was left alone with cruel, mocking shadows. The first paroxysm of grief was scarcely over when a carriage stopped in front of the house. Mrs. Le Bourgeois, one of my kind patrons, got out of it and entered the door. She seemed to bring sunshine with her handsome, cheery face. She came to where I was, and in her sweet way said, "Lizzie, I hear that you are going to New York to beg for money to buy your freedom. I have been thinking over the matter, and told Ma it would be a shame to allow you to go north to beg of what we should give you. You have many friends in St. Louis, and I am going to raise the $1,200 required among them. I have $200 put away for a present, am indebted to you $100, Mother owes you $50, and will add another $50 to it, and as I do not want the present, I will make the money a present to you. Don't start for New York now until I see what I can do among your friends." Like a ray of sunshine she came, and like a ray of sunshine she went away. The flowers no longer were withered, drooping. Again they seemed to bud and grow in fragrance and beauty. Mrs. Le Bourgeois, God bless her dear old heart, was more than successful. The $1,200 were raised, and at last my son and myself were free. Free, free, what a glorious ring to the word. Free, the bitter heart struggle was over. Free, the soul could go out to heaven and to God with no chains to clog its flight or pull it down. Free, the earth wore a brighter look, and the very stars seemed to sing with joy. Yes, free, free by the laws of man and the smile of God, and heaven bless them who made me so. The end. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a good week.